When Captain Nathaniel Mercer was taken on the muddy road south of Whitemarsh, he had already burned the map. That was the first mercy he allowed himself to remember, not the blow behind his ear, not the lurch of the frightened horse beneath him, not the boot that struck his ribs as he hit the ditch, not the rough canvas hood dragged over his face while rain soaked through wool and leather and turned the Maryland road to cold brown paste. The map was gone. The cipher marks, the courier turns, the miller names, the farmhouses that were farms by daylight and arteries of rebellion by night. The caches hidden beneath grain bins and broken chapel floors. The routes by which powder moved south and intelligence north. Those had gone to ash in a puddle before. British hands ever closed on him. By the time they bound his wrists and pitched him into a wagon, only memory remained. And memory, he knew, could still be betrayed. If this story holds you for even a moment, stay with Quiet Fires and subscribe, because some wars are fought with muskets, and some inside the human soul. Nathaniel was 32 years old, dark-haired, broad across the shoulders, and prematurely marked by the tired authority of a man who had spent too many seasons giving courage to other people while quietly rationing his own. Before the war, he had surveyed roads, fields, boundaries, and river approaches for local contracts. He knew where a wagon could pass in spring, where marsh would swallow a horse in October, where a ridge concealed movement from the main road, where planters lied about acreage, where widows concealed debts, where little Anglican churches kept better secrets than magistrates did. That knowledge had once made him useful. Then the colonies split inward. By the winter of 1777, he had become something more dangerous than a soldier in a line. He was a connective man, and such men always matter more in civil wars than the young imagine. He carried letters nobody signed, warnings nobody acknowledged sending, names nobody wished written, and instructions that turned frightened households into one quiet machinery of resistance. He knew which blacksmith in Prince George's County hollowed false axles for messages, which Quaker farmer refused public allegiance to either side and yet fed rebel couriers after dark, which vestryman in Annapolis hid cipher sheets beneath sermons about obedience, which widows received British officers with gracious tea and patriot riders with bread and stable room once the shutters were closed. He also knew too well that liberty traveled in compromised company. The American cause had brave men in it. It had vain men, too. It had preachers who talked of providence while hoarding goods, committee chairmen who spoke of liberty with one hand and signed seizure orders with the other, gentlemen who denounced tyranny over Madeira and returned home to command the labor of people whose freedom they never intended to imagine. Nathaniel had seen too much to worship slogans, but he had seen enough to know that occupation, once it learns the convenience of entering every household in the name of order, never willingly remembers how to stop. That was why he kept serving. That was why, when the wagon finally stopped and hands dragged him out, he bit through pain and silence together. He woke the next morning in a stone room beneath Fort Halden. The cell was not theatrical. No chains hanging dramatically from walls, no theatrical stain of old blood designed to frighten new prisoners. The British had grown more refined than that in places where they intended intelligence to matter. There was one barred slit of a window too high to reach, one iron ring set low into stone, one coarse blanket, one bucket, and one chair placed opposite his with such calm deliberation that it seemed to promise not rage, but method. By noon he met the man who would try to unmake him. Colonel Adrian Vale entered without ceremony, without the familiar swagger Nathaniel had learned to expect from many occupying officers. He was perhaps 42, spare rather than gaunt, tall, exact in movement, dressed in a blue coat that was good cloth but not ostentatious. His linen was immaculate, his queue was neat, his face, at first glance, might almost have been called scholarly, if not for the unsettling fact that nothing in the room escaped him. He carried a leather file instead of a riding crop. His hands were elegant, steady, and looked entirely capable of signing orders men died under. "That disappoints you," Vale said after a moment. Nathaniel kept his swollen mouth closed. "The file," Vale continued mildly. "Most prisoners prefer visible brutality. It simplifies hatred." Nathaniel managed, "Should I regret good manners, Colonel?" "No, but many men do. They rely upon their enemies being crude." But took the chair opposite, opened the file of customs revenue. "Captain Nathaniel Mercer, former surveyor, former provincial officer, current courier, organizer, and, depending on who is speaking, either servant of colonial liberty or architect of sedition. Widower, one son, one surviving sister. Protestant, reasonably educated, considered persuasive by local committees and irritatingly hard to bribe." "I confess, Captain, I had expected someone older." Nathaniel lifted his head. "I had expected someone uglier." A faint curve touched Vale's mouth and vanished. "That is the trouble with imagination. It flatters everyone." The first interviews were brief. That was not kindness. It was inventory. Vale asked about roads, depots, local militia captains, supply routes, cipher systems, church networks, committee channels, coastal contacts, and recent movements south of the Patuxent. Nathaniel answered with silence, with old truths, with partial truths, with knowledge already spoiled by time. He surrendered abandoned routes, dead names, rumors any competent officer might already possess, and one warehouse site that had been emptied 6 weeks earlier. He yielded nothing living. Vale did not strike him for it. He merely handed him over to men who did. The physical phase began so plainly that, for a day, Nathaniel almost mistook it for the work of lesser officers acting beneath Vale's notice. A guard cuffed him hard enough to split the inside of his lip while changing irons. Another drove a fist into his kidney when he was slow standing. On the second night, 2 men dragged him into a lower storeroom, held him upright by the arms, and beat him methodically across the ribs and shoulders until pain seemed to turn his body from structure into weather. No dramatic questions accompanied it, no shouted demands. Only impact, breath, nausea, and the humiliating realization that flesh can be taught obedience long before the mind consents to anything at all. Afterward, they let him lie on the floor long enough to understand that recovery itself would now be rationed. Then came hunger. Not the clean deprivation of one missed meal, but the mean, calculated reduction by which a man's thoughts begin to fray around the edges. Broth too thin to satisfy. Bread stale enough to mock the jaw. Water withheld, then offered. One day of near nothing followed by one decent plate, only to teach the stomach hope before disciplining it again. Nathaniel had known soldiers who joked about hunger as though it merely sharpened grievance into patriotism. Those men had never watched the mind begin to circle food with the same humiliating persistence that once belonged to duty. Sleep was handled with equal care. If he drifted, boots came at the door. If exhaustion finally pulled him under, lantern light flared in his face, or cold water struck his neck, or the irons were moved just enough to wake the bruises. Sometimes they sat him on a chair and kept him there through the deepest hours, while a clerk read irrelevant lines from confiscation orders in a droning voice designed not to frighten, but to abrade. Sometimes they left him in silence so complete He could hear his own pulse turning irregular with fatigue. By the fourth day, language itself had begun to separate from meaning. By the sixth, he understood why armies prize rhythm. Once rhythm is destroyed, a man can no longer tell whether his thoughts belong to conviction or merely to exhaustion. There are people who imagine endurance as one bright moment of heroism. A man tied to a post, a blow received, a noble silence, a trumpet somewhere in the distance to sanctify suffering. Real breaking is smaller, dirtier, and more administrative than that. It is bruises pressed exactly where yesterday's bruises already bloom. It is wrists bound just tightly enough to numb the fingers. It is the body kept upright when all it wants is the mercy of collapse. It is heat after cold, cold after fever, standing after beating, questioning after no sleep, food set down and taken away untouched because an answer did not come quickly enough. It is the endless conversion of pain into a schedule. Vale excelled at schedules. Nathaniel learned that slowly. The colonel did not direct the first beatings with visible zeal, but neither did he interrupt them. Instead, he observed what remained afterward, which side Nathaniel protected when he breathed, how long he took to stand, whether pain made him angry, pleading, or careful. When the body had been worn down enough, Vale resumed the interviews himself. Only then did the true method begin. A long examination after no sleep. A chair with one leg subtly shorter than the others to disturb balance over hours. Questions repeated until language itself began to feel unreal. False news introduced, then withdrawn, to observe what changed in the prisoner's breathing. Silence used not as mercy, but as a chamber in which fear amplified itself. The fort kept records of everything. A clerk with a narrow nose and excellent penmanship sat outside the room during some examinations and wrote down time, response latency, visible physical reactions, fragments of speech muttered under stress, all with the dispassion of a man accounting for grain. Nathaniel understood then that they were not merely seeking information. They were studying him as structure, what drove him, which injuries made him reckless, which silences held, which subjects sent a flicker across his face before discipline caught up. On the fourth night of that second stage, Vale placed a Bible on the table between them. Nathaniel stared. It was small, leather-bound, worn at the corners, the spine repaired with a line of blue thread so neat and patient he recognized it instantly. Lydia's hand. His wife had repaired it during a winter storm the year before. Her cough turned serious enough that neither of them could any longer pretend it was temporary. She had tucked rosemary in the Psalms for the scent. After her death, Nathaniel had left the Bible at his sister Martha's house with several letters, a silver spoon from his mother, and the lock of hair he had not had strength to throw away. Vale rested 2 fingertips lightly on the cover. "Your sister keeps a careful house," he said. "Your nephew does not. He left the back latch undone. Your son asked one of my men why soldiers always take things first and explain afterward." Nathaniel surged against the irons so hard the metal cut skin. "If you touched my family." Vale's voice did not rise. "I already have. That is why the threat comes to you now as fact, not speculation." Rage flared, but beneath it something raw and more dangerous opened. Terror, not for himself, but for those not arranged for this kind of war. Elias was 9, stubborn, bright, too observant for safety. Martha had buried 2 infants before she was 30, and still moved through household labor with the grim grace of one who had made peace with grief only because there was bread to bake. Her husband, Jonathan Pike, was a cooper by trade and a cautious man by temperament. the sort war mistrusts because it cannot recruit him cleanly into fanaticism. None of them knew the full shape of what Nathaniel carried. That had been his protection for them. But innocence is never as protective as principled men claim. "You mean to make me choose," Nathaniel said. "No," Vale replied. "The age has already done that. I am merely declining to let you hide the cost behind rhetoric." That became the true front between them. What is a cause worth when your child can be reached through your silence? What is a father worth if he saves one boy by condemning 20 nameless households whose paths and loyalties he carries in memory? What is patriotism once you have seen how much vanity and appetite it can shelter? What is empire when its most intelligent servants can speak order so elegantly that disorder itself begins to look like treason to the weak-minded? Nathaniel had no clean answer to any of it. Some nights, half delirious, he hated every committee he had ever served. Other nights he remembered British searches, confiscations, collective punishments, farms broken open under lawful pretext, and he returned to silence, not because silence felt heroic, but because surrender felt irreversible. Outside Fort Halden, the war went on without concern for his private trial. Bits of news drifted in through guardroom talk, overheard orders, careless taunts, and Vale's own occasional references. A warehouse near the Chester burned. Loyalists driven from 2 farms in Virginia. Rebel seizures of grain. British retaliation against a church suspected of harboring couriers. A magistrate dragged from bed by local patriots and forced to swear neutrality he did not mean. Men on both sides insisting history would one day sanctify what necessity presently made ugly. Vale sometimes spoke of such matters as though weather had entered the room with him. "You people speak often of liberty," he said one evening, after Nathaniel had been kept awake nearly 30 hours. "Yet the committees I observe seem remarkably eager to confiscate, threaten, and purge." Nathaniel's head rested against cold stone. "You people speak often of order, and hang a good deal on the word. Order prevents fragmentation. Order for whom? For those who understand that once local passions are invited to rule themselves, neighbors discover ancient appetites with astonishing speed." Nathaniel let out one bitter breath. That was nearly a laugh. "And empire cures appetite? No, it manages scale. By entering every house you suspect. By preserving continuity where provincial men would turn injury into ideology." Nathaniel forced himself upright, every muscle hot with fatigue. "Say it plain, Colonel. You do not trust people to govern themselves because, once they begin, they discover they despise being managed by those who call contempt civilization." Vale regarded him with unnerving calm. "I trust almost no one to govern anything, Captain. That includes empires, colonies, committees, and men in uniforms. The difference is that empire at least remembers paperwork." Nathaniel hated him most in such moments, not because the man was foolish, but because he was not. A stupid enemy is easy to resist. An intelligent one can make surrender sound morally adult. After 10 days, the conditions changed. Nathaniel was moved from the underground cell to a room above the infirmary with a narrow bed, a locked desk, a wash basin, and a small window facing east over marsh and road. The kindness was strategic, and Vale did not insult him by pretending otherwise. "Men think differently once allowed to feel human," the colonel said. "We are going to determine whether humanity assists or weakens your judgment." The new room gave Nathaniel 3 dangerous gifts: better sleep, better sight, and time. He learned the rhythms of the fort, which officers liked late cards, which sentries stamped their feet in cold weather, which wagons arrived before dawn, which warehouse door stuck in damp conditions, where the south wall narrowed near the old drainage run, which officers rode out and returned cursing mud, which messenger wore his dispatch case too carefully, suggesting not reports, but original papers. Pain had not diminished Nathaniel's eye. It had sharpened it into compulsion. It was there he first met Sarah Whitlock. She entered carrying water, bandages, and a ledger of issued medicines under one arm. Her dress was plain brown wool under a white apron, her hair dark and pinned severely, her face neither conventionally soft nor severe, but composed in the way of a woman who has learned that men notice what disturbs them and ignore what does not. Her eyes were hazel, grave, and capable of withholding pity without withholding perception. "You are fevered," she said, after touching the side of his neck with cool fingers. "If you die this week, the physician will blame the damp, and the colonel will blame the physician, and I will have to rewrite 3 entries in the register. Try not to be inconsiderate." Nathaniel, half sunk in exhaustion, stared at her. "Do you always sound like comfort given under protest?" "I sound like arithmetic," she replied. She cleaned the torn skin at his wrists with efficient care. No fluttering sympathy, no sanctimony, no unnecessary conversation. When she finished, she tightened the fresh wrapping and said, almost as an afterthought, "If you mean to test the window bars, save yourself the trouble. 2 men tried before you. One lost fingers to frost, and the other to foolish optimism." "Then you know what I'm thinking." "No," she said. "I know what men in rooms think when given one patch of sky." She returned later with broth. Later still with linen. On the 3rd day she replaced the bandage again, leaned a fraction closer than the task required, and murmured, barely audible, "If you insist on noticing exits, observe the south wall after midnight, not the east road at dawn. The dawn road is what every desperate man sees first." Nathaniel looked at her sharply. She did not meet his eyes. When she left, the room felt altered. It would have been easier if Sarah Whitlock had turned out to be a familiar kind of secret ally, some dramatic hidden patriot trapped among enemies and yearning to assist a noble captive. But the truth of her proved more interesting and more dangerous than that. Her father, he learned by degrees, had been a Maryland judge of loyal principle, not because he worshipped London, but because he feared what unchecked provincial power would do once it learned to call itself virtue. Local committees had stripped him of authority, then quietly injured families adjacent to his politics, and called the whole business necessary purification. Her brother had joined a loyalist regiment and died of camp fever before seeing a major engagement. Her mother now lived with cousins, keeping up the dignity of reduced means, because reduced means were the one humiliation polite society allows women to perform gracefully. Sarah had seen both sides use moral language as cover for appetite. That left marks. "What do you believe in, then?" Nathaniel asked her several days later when she was changing a dressing on his shoulder after a guard had handled him too roughly during transfer to interview. She tied off the linen. "In supervision." "That is not a faith. It is the most useful substitute I have found." "For what?" "For trusting men who speak in absolutes." Nathaniel watched her profile in the slanting afternoon light. "You distrust my side." "I distrust any side that claims suffering has made it pure." "And the British?" She gave him one cool glance. "The British have had the advantage of form. Form can make brutality look like civilization to people who value clean gloves." He smiled, despite himself, then regretted it when his split lip stung. From then on, their conversations became a second education inside his confinement. She never fed him intelligence in the crude sense. She was too careful for that, and too intelligent to become foolish merely because a man in pain might still be worth regarding clearly. But she allowed facts to fall with deliberate placement. Which quartermaster undercounted lamp oil? Which sentry on the south wall coughed near dawn? Which officer spoke with more appetite than discipline? Which cellar room beneath the records office held confiscated papers? Which messenger had ridden north and not returned? Which surgeon drank too much and therefore spoke too freely? She made ordinary sentences perform extraordinary work. Nathaniel responded in kind. He did not flatter her with easy compliments. He argued. "You say committees abuse power," he told her one rain-heavy evening. "They do. I have watched them do it. But a bad local tyrant can at least be named. Distant power enters with language too large to answer." She folded a cloth over the back of a chair. "You assume nearness makes accountability possible. Sometimes it makes revenge intimate. And you assume distance civilizes ambition." "No," she said quietly. "I assume ambition always travels better under a flag than alone." Their words sharpened, then settled, then sharpened again. He discovered she did not need him to seem morally unblemished in order to speak honestly with him. That was a relief he had not expected. She knew rebellion could become vanity, knew new governments inherit old temptations, knew virtue performed in public often cloaks greed arranged in private. Yet she also knew the British system around her had grown talented at confusing continuity with moral right. What formed between them was not love named aloud. It was trust under pressure, tension without license, and the dangerous comfort of finding another mind unwilling to lie about history in order to survive it. Sometimes a pause lasted a heartbeat too long. Sometimes gratitude entered the room and had to be disguised as argument. Sometimes one of them spoke with an intimacy neither would have admitted if daylight had asked directly. But nothing between them could afford the softness of declaration. War had made witness more useful than tenderness, and perhaps more binding. Meanwhile, Adrian Vale continued his work. The colonel never abandoned the family line of pressure because he knew it was the deepest cut available. But he used it with such precision that Nathaniel came to understand the man's method was not merely coercive, it was interpretive. Vale wanted to redefine Nathaniel's silence until silence itself looked like vanity, to persuade him that endurance did not serve liberty, only self-image, to make paternal love feel incompatible with public duty, to strip him of any narrative in which suffering retained meaning larger than obstinacy. One afternoon, Vale arrived with a school copybook in hand. Nathaniel's breath stopped. "Your son writes with vigor," the colonel observed. His letters lean forward as if perpetually ready to accuse. Charming in moderation. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "You read it." "I had it examined." "There is a difference." "What do you want?" Vale laid the copybook on the desk and opened to a page where Elias had practiced sums, and then, in a lower margin, drawn a horse with absurdly powerful legs. Nathaniel knew the drawing immediately. The boy always gave horses heroic limbs. Lydia used to laugh at that. "What I want," Vale said, "is for you to stop pretending your suffering is born in isolation. Every day you refuse, you make decisions in absentia for people who do not know they were summoned into your theater." Nathaniel's hands shook. "If I speak, I make other decisions in absentia for people who trusted me." "Yes." Vale sat back slightly. "At last we are discussing the same subject." The colonel's voice softened. That made it worse. "I do not ask whether you love your family. Love is common. I ask whether you are willing to sacrifice families you have never seen in order to preserve the story you tell about why your own may be endangered. You Americans are very fond of converting intimate fear into public philosophy. Nathaniel looked at the copybook and forced himself not to reach for it. And you British, he said at last, are very fond of converting domination into moral adulthood. Vale's expression barely changed, but something lit behind the eyes. Good. Anger is at least alive. Take the book away. Why? Does the sight of the child weaken you? No, Nathaniel said and lifted his gaze. The use of him disgusts me. For the first time, Adrian Vale's face held not amusement, not irritation, but the faintest impression of something like respect, touched by sorrow. He closed the copybook and rose. That night, Nathaniel did not sleep at all. He thought of Lydia, of her blue thread repairs, of the quiet endurance with which she had hidden the blood in her handkerchiefs until hiding it became impossible, of how she had once stood in the doorway at dusk, hair loosened by heat, and said with no drama at all, "If this war takes you, I should at least like honesty beforehand." He had tried then to tell her he served only in modest ways. She had looked at him with affectionate contempt and answered, "Nathaniel, I did not marry you for modest ways." He thought of Elias, who still asked questions as if adults were repositories of clear answers rather than frightened arrangements of compromise. He thought of Martha, who had told him when Lydia died that grief, if one let it, could become a species of vanity, and that the dead were seldom helped by our talent for kneeling before our own pain. These memories did not strengthen him in any simple sense. They made him ache. But the ache kept him from becoming merely strategic. That mattered. A week later, Sarah brought him a folded supply inventory. On its face, it listed bark, vinegar, lint, needles, lamp oil. Between two columns, in the smallest hand imaginable, 6 words had been written. Your son moved yesterday. Safe for now. Nathaniel closed his eyes. Relief entered him so violently it was almost pain. When he opened them, Sarah was adjusting the basin as if nothing unusual had occurred. You should not have done this, he whispered. No, she said. I should not have done several things this month. Why risk it? She did not look at him. Because reality is becoming too expensive when every fact passes through official mouths. He said her name for the first time then. Sarah. She stilled for a fraction of a second, then resumed her work. Do not make a habit of gratitude. It becomes noticeable. The fort itself had begun to change in ways both of them could feel. Searches increased. Inventories were checked twice. A courier had been caught outside Baltimore with a cipher pattern uncomfortably close to one Nathaniel had used months earlier. A raid in Norfolk had succeeded with suspicious exactness, suggesting some intelligence leak or some chance too precise to be chance. Major Edmund Fenwick, recently posted through the district, had begun making himself obnoxiously present. Nathaniel saw him once from the window, broad-faced, red-cheeked, handsome only in the way appetite can masquerade as vitality. He rode as if the horse were an inconvenience, and walked as if every room belonged to him morally before it belonged to him physically. Sarah's expression tightened whenever Fenwick's name came up. He is favored by men who mistake cruelty for decisiveness, she said once. You dislike him. I dislike infection. That same week, Vale began a different species of interrogation. He brought not threats, but arguments. One evening, he arrived with 2 glasses and a decanter, poured wine into only one of them, and sat opposite Nathaniel in the infirmary room rather than the formal chamber below. You despise me, the colonel said. This is understandable. but I wonder whether you have yet understood my objection to your cause." Nathaniel, wrists bandaged and side still tender from a previous beating by lesser hands, said nothing. Vale lifted the glass. "You imagine the issue is taxation, representation, legal autonomy, charters, rights. Those are the words gentlemen use in pamphlets because pamphlets require polish. My objection is simpler. Men in unstable societies reach for purity. Purity licenses every subsequent cruelty because history is forever being born, and therefore everything can be excused as labor pain." Nathaniel looked toward the rain on the window. "And empire excuses cruelty as maintenance." "Exactly," Vale said. "Which is less intoxicating and, therefore, occasionally less deadly." Nathaniel turned back to him. "You say that as though boredom were a virtue. Continuity often is. No, continuity can be merely the long duration of someone else's contempt." Vale set down the glass. "You were a surveyor. You understand gradients. There are degrees of bad arrangement. Why then attach yourself to men who promise impossible goods?" "Because impossible goods remain preferable to permanent permission." "To do what?" "To decide we are fit only to be managed." The colonel was silent a moment. "And if self-government produces smaller tyrants in greater number?" "It may." Nathaniel's voice was rough but steady. "Then at least the blame lives among us where it can be seen." Vale studied him. "You still believe that?" "I believe responsibility without excuse is the only form of adulthood nations ever get." Something passed through Vale's expression too quickly to name. By the third week, Nathaniel understood that his captivity had become a contest not merely over information, but over authorship. Adrian Vale intended to write the meaning of his suffering before Nathaniel could. If the prisoner broke, he would break not simply by speaking, but by accepting the colonel's frame, that human love invalidated public duty, that disillusion invalidated loyalty, that intelligence matured naturally into surrender. Nathaniel resisted as much by refusing the frame as by refusing the questions. That made the contest intimate in a way plain violence never could. Late one afternoon, when thunder rolled over the marsh and the fort smelled of wet powder, Sarah stood at the window looking out with him while a storm dragged gray light across the road. "Do you still believe your side should win?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "Even now?" "Especially now." She turned to him. "Why?" He took a long moment before answering. "Because once a government grows accustomed to entering private life whenever fear instructs it to, it does not stop when the fear passes. It merely looks for new reasons. And if your new republic does the same, then it will deserve opposition too." She regarded him as though measuring not the answer, but the cost at which it had been reached. That is a more dangerous kind of patriotism than the one men cheer at taverns. It is the only kind left to adults. For the first time, something softened in her face without becoming tenderness in the easy sense. Recognition, perhaps, or grief that had found an answering language. The next turn came at dusk 2 days later. Vale entered, carrying a sealed packet, and dismissed the guard with a glance. He laid 3 papers on the desk, one by one. An intercept naming a rebel courier expected near the Patuxent. A report placing Martha Pike's household, along with Elias, under renewed observation. And an unsigned pledge: immediate protection, removal, and property guarantees for Nathaniel's immediate family if he would identify 1 active committee head in Virginia and 1 safe farmhouse on the Maryland Road. Not the whole network, not every name, just enough to make refusal look theatrical. Nathaniel stared at the papers until the words blurred. 1 committee head, 1 farmhouse. not a revolution crushed, not the final betrayal of all things. Only a wedge, a beginning, a concession shaped exactly to fit the weakness of a loving man. Vale watched his face with near clinical stillness. "No audience would condemn you," the colonel said softly. "A father chooses his son. A brother chooses his sister. Flesh is not less sacred because pamphlets prefer abstractions. Speak, and I will call it human. Refuse, and you may preserve your self-image at the expense of people who never volunteered for martyrdom." Nathaniel felt the whole room contract to one point. He saw Elias in the yard with his absurd wooden sword, announcing he was defending America and the chickens simultaneously. He saw Martha kneading dough by candlelight, shoulders set against worry she thought she hid. He saw a farmhouse door opening at midnight to admit a courier whose arrival depended on trust. He saw Sarah moving carefully through the fort under eyes growing more suspicious each day. "Who are you protecting?" Vale asked. Nathaniel lifted his head. "Today?" "Yes." "Myself from your language." Vale's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. Nathaniel drew one painful breath. "Suppose I grant all your observations, Colonel. Suppose I admit my side contains vanity, hypocrisy, theft, ambition, even cruelty. Suppose I tell you I have seen men speak of liberty while treating other human beings as stock. Suppose I say aloud that some committee chairmen are smaller tyrants rehearsing for larger offices. Suppose I concede every disillusion your intelligence prizes. Does that make empire innocent because it is articulate?" "No," Vale said. "Then we are done." Silence stretched. At last, the colonel gathered the papers. "I wish," he said quietly, "that you were simpler." Nathaniel nearly smiled. "You too." Vale left without another word. The room remained still after the door shut, but Nathaniel knew the balance had changed. Something had been tested there beyond the ordinary. The question was whether the answer had satisfied or endangered him. He did not have long to wonder. Near midnight on the following day, Sarah came in without a lantern, closed the door softly behind her, and stood motionless until his eyes found her shape in the darkness. "They are moving you at dawn," she whispered. He sat up too quickly, and pain cut through his side. "Where?" "Officially to New York for formal intelligence review. Unofficially because Major Fenwick has persuaded command that Vale's method has become indulgent." Her voice tightened on the last word. "If Fenwick takes charge of you on the road, subtlety ends." Nathaniel felt cold move through him. "And Vale?" "Arguing against the transfer. He may lose." She stepped closer and placed something in his hand. A key. "The South Passage door," she said. "One use only. After the second bell. There will be rain, which helps." The sentry on the lower wall coughs near dawn and favors his left leg when the weather turns. The stable boy drinks from the quartermaster's flask after midnight and sleeps harder than he should. If you go then. He stared at the key in his palm. "You will be ruined." "Yes." "Why do this?" She drew in a breath that shook once before steadiness returned. "Because there are moments when remaining useful to bad arrangements becomes another form of consent. Come with me." The words escaped before he could weigh them. In the dark, he could not fully see her expression, only feel the pause. "If I vanish with you," she said at last, "I become your convert in everyone's eyes, including perhaps my own. I would like, if possible, to remain my own witness a little longer." He closed his fingers over the key. "Sarah, no. Save strength, you will need it." She stepped back toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing," she whispered. "If you meet Vale before the wall, Do not assume you understand the whole room." Before he could answer, she was gone. The second bell sounded through rain. Nathaniel rose, every bruise speaking, every joint protesting. He used the key on the south passage door and entered a narrow service corridor that smelled of damp mortar and old herbs. Beyond it lay the infirmary yard, dark and slick with rain. Somewhere above, shutters knocked in wind. Somewhere farther off, a horse stamped. He moved slowly at first, then with gathering urgency, one hand against the wall when the world tilted. The courtyard blurred under rainfall. Lanterns burned at two distant points, leaving the space between them surprisingly deep in shadow. He crossed behind stacked barrels, passed the rear of the infirmary, and reached the stable yard. The lower postern was 30 paces beyond. He might have made it. Then Adrian Vale stepped from the shelter of an archway and stood in the rain before him. No pistol, no drawn sword, only gloves in one hand, and a face more tired than Nathaniel had yet seen. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Rain stitched the silence together. "She chose badly," Vale said at last. "No," Nathaniel answered. "She chose humanly." A shout rang somewhere in the upper yard. Another answered. Vale glanced once toward the sound, then back at him. "Fenwick has half the garrison convinced your transfer is the only proof that interrogation here has not been compromised. If he finds you missing, he will tear this place open to vindicate himself. Then let him explain your missing prisoner." Something like a brief, bleak amusement touched the colonel's mouth. "You still think in terms of victory? I think in terms of motion." Vale stood very still. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Less official, more nakedly tired. "There was always a defect in the file on you," he said. "It listed your roles, not your center." Nathaniel's fingers tightened on the wet key. "And now?" "Now I know. You were never guarding only names. You were guarding the belief that suffering can still be chosen for something larger than self-regard, even after disillusion." Footsteps sounded faintly overhead. Nathaniel swallowed. "Do you envy it?" Vale did not answer that question. Instead, he said, "Take the gray mare in the second stall. She favors the left on bad ground, but runs true once settled. The river road is watched. Go west through the pine farms, then cut south. Do not attempt the chapel ford. It looks passable in rain and kills tired men." Nathaniel stared at him through the downpour. "Why?" he asked. For the first time since their acquaintance began, Adrian Vale looked less like an officer than a man standing at the brink of a choice he had postponed too long. "Because," he said quietly, "I wished to know whether loyalty survives when every argument against it becomes intelligent." A lantern flare appeared at the far end of the yard. Vale stepped aside. "Go," he said. "And if they catch you again, I shall have to become exactly what you already believe me to be." Nathaniel moved. He reached the stable, mounted clumsily, nearly lost the saddle, recovered, and drove the gray mare through rain toward the outer dark. Behind him, bells began to hammer. Men shouted. Somewhere in that unraveling, Sarah Whitlock's life divided forever into before and after the key. He rode through black pines and marsh smell and the wild, feverish thudding of blood in his own ears. Twice he thought he heard pursuit. Once it was real, and once only memory. By dawn, the world was a soaked blur of fields and bare trees. He held the saddle more than sat it. At the edge of one rise, he turned once, not because prudence advised it, but because some instinct refused to leave the night uninterpreted. Fort Halden stood dim under breaking cloud, hard and gray and distant. And in that instant, with the bells still faint across the wet morning, and Adrian Vale's final words burning in his mind, Nathaniel understood only this: his imprisonment had not ended at the wall. Some larger design had just begun to reveal itself. He did not yet know whether Adrian Vale had spared him out of conscience, calculation, divided allegiance, or some colder experiment with human fidelity. He did not know what Sarah had truly risked, or whether she could survive the search that would follow. He did not know whether the colonel had released a prisoner, protected a witness, betrayed his own command, or set the next stage of a trial whose deepest purpose remained hidden. What he knew was worse. The man who had tried to break him might not have been serving only the side he wore. And if that was true, then everything Nathaniel had endured at Fort Halden, every blow, every starvation, every broken hour of sleep, every pressure on family, every philosophical wound, every measured cruelty, belonged to a game larger, more intimate, and more dangerous than capture alone. By the time the mayor staggered toward the Quaker farm where he would collapse before noon, one thought had settled into him with the force of prophecy. If Adrian Vale had opened that road for him, then the real war between them was not over. It had only changed shape. And somewhere behind the British lines, in a fort now tearing itself apart before daylight, Sarah Whitlock was still inside it. And that was the truth he carried into dawn. Escape had saved his life, but not ended the question, because the next chapter would ask what Adrian Vale truly was, what Sarah had just sacrificed, and whether Fort Halden had been a prison, a test, or the opening move of something far more dangerous. If you want the answer, come with me into part 2.